is the role of the United Nations in American foreign policy. And the most appropriate speaker is our guest, the Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs, Mr. Kim Holmes. The Bureau, of course, is charged with creating, developing, and implementing American foreign policy in the United Nations, specifically almost the title of tonight's presentation. I should note also in passing that this is a belated recognition of UN Day as well, October, of course, of this year. And I should note the United Nations Association of Maryland is being revitalized, and we have several of their members not only with us tonight, but several members of our council, of course, are active in that revitalization. Our guest is a graduate of Florida Central University. He received his MA and PhD degrees in history from Georgetown University. He studied at the Institute for European History in Mainz, Germany during that period of time. He taught at Georgetown after his receiving his degrees there. He also was at Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy as a research fellow. And he joined the Heritage Foundation in 1985. He was director of their Foreign and Defense Studies program. In it, as part of that, he was a senior analyst for national security matters, specializing in arms control and NATO and East-West relations. He then became director of the Institute of International Affairs at the same at Heritage, and in that position was the primary spokesman for Heritage on foreign and defense matters. He was the senior editor of their publications, and also served as managing officer responsible for their research and programs. And during that period of time, as you all know, I think, Heritage grew enormously, both in its size and its reputation. It has a very distinct place in American life today as one of our major foundations. Mr. Holmes was appointed as our Assistant Secretary of State in 2002. I happened to be at that 8th floor reception for you when you were presented by Mr. Powell, so I remember that time well. In any case, he's been in this wonderful position for 2 years. You know the topic for the evening. It's my great pleasure to present the Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs, the Honorable Kim R. Holmes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burd. I must say that I am very impressed that you could go through my resume like that without any notes from memory, because frankly, I can't even do it. Sometimes I get some things mixed up about 1985 to 1988. But it's indeed a great pleasure to be with all of you here this evening, and it's an honor to be invited here for the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs and to be in this lovely room and to have this lovely view of downtown Baltimore. It's quite a privilege to be here. Your interest, I'm sure, since you are members of this great organization, in foreign policy is certainly understandable, not only because many of you may have an interest in international affairs, but also because of this great city of Baltimore, and indeed the state of Maryland has played an important role in historic events affecting U.S. foreign policy. I know this because I am a Marylander myself, whose career, as you said, Dr. Burd, has largely focused on international relations and trade. But I also know this because I am a European historian by education. I've enjoyed visiting Baltimore to explore Maryland's rich historical ties to Europe. Take Fort McHenry, for example. The fort's singular importance unfolded in the early 1800s when Britain and France were at war. American ships on these waters were often captured by the British, who confiscated their goods and forced their crews to fight for the Royal Navy. Americans didn't consider that a sign of proper bilateral relations at the time. They declared war on Great Britain in 1812, as you know, to protect free trade and the rights of American sailors. Privateers and clipper ships took to the waters and sank many of their ships. Britain responded in 1814 with a 25-hour assault by sea on Fort McHenry. Local militiamen and the U.S. Army soldiers fought back, literally under the now famous Star-Spangled Banner. They fought to defend their homeland, preserve their livelihoods, and to protect their God-given rights. And they won that battle, and the rest is history, as they say. It's a great American story. All of us know it from very early times in our education: freedom, defending the homeland, free trade, foreign relations, and war. These are issues that we care about just as deeply today as Americans did back then. The difference is that today, Britons fight with us in this war and not against us. The United Kingdom is one of our strongest allies, particularly in Iraq. But there is one more thing that is extremely different today than those times over a couple of hundred years ago. We have many international organizations in which to advance our foreign policy. And one of those is indeed the United Nations, which is so prominent in the news today. The United Nations turns 60 next year. It is a large, complex, and growing more so every single day. Its budget surpasses $3 billion. Much of the work its specialized agencies do is work that we want done. The United States remains the UN's largest contributor. This would not be the case if we thought that the UN was insignificant to our foreign policy. We pay 22% of its regular budget and 27% of its peacekeeping costs. And on top of that, we give generously to support the work of UN agencies providing humanitarian relief, electoral assistance, food aid, and more. Despite all of this, we also know that the United Nations has significant problems. The news is peppered with some of them every single day. The just released United Nations Secretary General's high-level panel report speaks to some of these problems. The point is that many people are now questioning the UN's effectiveness. They question its purpose. They question its capabilities, its management. They question its viability in meeting today's threats. However, I can assure you, dealing as I do every day with the United Nations, that President Bush believes the UN is still a vital institution. It is an important tool of U.S. foreign policy. Now, if you take Maryland, for example, you'll understand why. Commerce by sea and by air is very important to Maryland's economy. It is far safer today because of our work in UN agencies to strengthen international maritime and aviation security standards, all working through UN organizations. Maryland's medical, biotech, and research institutions share their expertise with developing countries that don't have the resources to fight their own health and economic challenges. They work in collaboration with agencies like the World Health Organization and UNESCO, for example. And the UN works with the United States and also with groups like Catholic Relief Services and the Lutheran Synod's Immigration and Relief Organization. Both of those are headquartered here in Baltimore to help people all around the world. So the UN's reach is wide because of our commitment to it. If there are just 3 points that I can leave with you tonight, these are what they would be. First of all, we, the United States government, we Americans, we invest a great deal in the UN to make it an effective multilateral instrument. We would not do that if we thought it was going the way of the League of Nations. I would go so far as to say that if we did not have international mechanisms like the United Nations to help implement global responses to terrorism, to nuclear proliferation, to failed states, to HIV/AIDS, we would spearhead efforts to create such an organization. The second point I would leave with you, and those of you from major corporations will certainly understand this point, the United Nations is like every organization that faces new challenges and must figure out how to adapt to them. Is it a problem with mission? Is it a problem with leadership, structure? Is it a problem of resources? Is there something wrong with the product that's being provided? What are the best practices that need to be applied? Which are most cumbersome? Which are effective? Is the organization sticking to its core purpose? Or is it taking on too much? Has it allowed its work to become too politicized or to be distracted by politics? Does it need to innovate, partner, expand, or shed projects to be more effective? Does it need more accountability to its investors, or more transparency, oversight, or due diligence? And does it have the leadership who has the will to act? Now, these are all good questions. The UN's leadership and every member state of the United Nations would do well to be asking themselves. And we hope that the high-level panel, who just recently finished its report on United Nations reform, asked themselves these questions as well. We are certainly asking these questions. We have long sought to use common sense principles like these to help the United Nations adopt a more responsible and a more responsive management style. We've had some successes, but there is certainly a lot more to do. If the UN is to become more effective, or more of an effective force in securing international peace, then more U.S. leadership and more U.S. participation will be required, not less. My third point is this, is that no one, either in this country or abroad, should look at the United Nations as an instrument to exercise influence to counterweight the United States, which is its most significant member. The United Nations cannot be effective without the leadership of the United States. Any attempt to use the UN to constrain, rather to work with, the United States can only fail. Such attempts would tend to encourage countries to look to other organizations and look to other international mechanisms, which could, in the end, marginalize the United Nations itself. The United Nations gains its legitimacy from its members. It is not an end in and of itself. It is a means to an end. The UN does not hover above the host of nations like some secular church, embodying the international moral equivalence of divine principle, which sometimes people call international legitimacy. Rather, its legitimacy is a reflection of these nations. At best, a place where they can come together to solve problems and reach consensus on important issues, both of pragmatic issues, but also issues of principle. The United Nations should not be seen as the sole source of international legitimacy. We still live in an international system that looks ultimately to nations. A system of nation states where, to be sure, universal principles such as democracy and human rights, on the one hand, and national sovereignty, on the other hand, exist in tension in some countries, as they do in Sudan and North Korea and in Cuba. But they also exist in harmony in other places, as they do in the United States and most of Europe and many other places in the world. Our goal as Americans should be to transform the United Nations to the point where more nations, indeed hopefully at some point all nations, are in the latter category. In other words, where sovereign governments actually protect human rights and democracy rather than threaten them. A United Nations of democracies would eliminate the contradiction between sovereignty and universal principles that we now often see in the United Nations. A contradiction that bedevils the institution when Libya is elected to chair the Human Rights Commission, and when Syria, a supporter of terrorism, is elected to the Security Council. Now, to the extent that the reputation of the UN suffers today, it does so largely because so many of its member states are not democracies. They do not believe in and practice the UN's universal principles of human rights. And because of their large numbers, they have a great deal of influence in the affairs of the United Nations. Now, to be sure, not all of the UN's problems can be laid at this doorstep. Indeed, sadly, even some democratic nations do not always act to support these principles. I will fully concede that point. But many of them can. The influence of these non-democratic states extends beyond their numbers. Sometimes even democratic states excuse human rights abuses in developing nations. Sometimes they lack the resolve to stand up to threats from non-democratic states. And sometimes they even defend non-democratic states against criticism. This is unfortunate. These democratic states do this, to be sure, in the name of protecting the little guy, and in this case often developing nations. Yet there are too many developing nations that are thriving democracies to turn a blind eye on repression. Surely this trend is not good for the United Nations, and we democracies don't do non-democracies any favors by indulging them. Democratic nations need to be the conscience of the United Nations. They should stand up for what they and what the UN should believe. They should not be making excuses for its failures. And they should object to any ludicrous inference that the main threats to international peace and security emanate not from rogue states and not from terrorists, as they surely do, but as some say, from the shores of the United States. Because the challenges confronting the United Nations are many, it's facing scrutiny, as many of you know. Even those who originally called for the high-level panel understands that its problems do indeed need attention. The Security Council, the Commission on Human Rights, and other UN bodies succeed when their members choose a course of action based on principles like human rights. And as I mentioned, unfortunately, this is not always the case. Now, unless the United Nations forthrightly addresses allegations about kickbacks in the Oil for Food program and sex scandals among senior staff or UN peacekeepers in the Congo, the UN stature in the eyes of the world will continue to suffer. The United Nations General Assembly also needs rethinking. It spends too much time debating the same resolutions year after year without making much progress. A good example is the excessive number of resolutions targeting Israel and blatantly ignoring Palestinian responsibility to stop suicide bombings and other terrorist attacks. Now, what the General Assembly doesn't do can be equally frustrating. That was the case last week when a vote to block consideration of a resolution that we had sought on Sudan because of the humanitarian crisis and disaster, indeed some say genocide, that's occurring in Darfur. Of all the chances for the General Assembly to gain stature, it was then, but it failed to act. Another question is to how to improve the Commission on Human Rights. Sudan is one of the members of this commission as well. This year, it was nominated by its African group peers for an unprecedented third term to serve alongside other countries with questionable commitments to human rights, such as Cuba and Zimbabwe. Now, many people are calling for UN reform. This is especially so in the light of the high-level panel's report that was released last week. I would say the panel's proposals are ambitious. There are over 100 recommendations in this report. The panel clearly tried to account for diverse international views about the United Nations and how it should be responding to today's threats, challenges, and opportunities. We in the Bush administration certainly welcome this effort. Now it's time for member states to study these proposals and ask themselves some basic questions. Can they ensure more accountability? Can they ensure more transparency in the UN? Can they ensure more democracy in the United Nations? Can they make the UN more effective overall, but especially in contributing to our collective security? The United States particularly welcomes proposals on secretariat reform, on peacekeeping, and also on terrorism. We agree, for example, with the report's recommendation that all states should join the 12 international counterterrorism conventions and protocols. And we also think that all states should become party to and implement the protocol on trafficking in persons. There are also some positive elements in the way the report treats the issue of the use of force. It calls on the Security Council to be more proactive in dealing with new threats, such as terrorism, proliferation, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And the panel agrees that a threatened state does not have to wait until it's attacked to act in order to exercise its inherent right to self-defense, as is recognized in Article 51 of the UN Charter. We agree as well that the Charter's provisions on self-defense should not be rewritten, though we do believe that that right must today be understood and applied in the context of the very different threats that we are facing. Now, the Security Council does play a key role in maintaining international peace and security under the UN Charter. But too often it has been unable to end conflicts, to halt threats of aggression, or to prevent proliferation. The right of self-defense thus plays an essential role in maintaining international peace and security. We do have, however, serious concern about some of the proposals on this particular issue. Given today's threats, we should not be putting new constraints on self-defense. But that is what would happen if the proposal that only the Security Council could authorize the preventive use of force were adopted. Even in a case where terrorists have a nuclear weapon, the report says a state should go to the Security Council first for authorization to take preventive military action. Now, whether the Council could decide soon enough for effective military action is another matter. Such constraints, and let me be frank, will never be acceptable to the United States. We are certainly open to reforming the Security Council. Any proposals for change need to be judged by whether they will make it more effective than it is today. The Security Council needs to be able to react in a timely fashion to changing circumstances. Proposals for change, moreover, need to be able to command wide international support if they are to be viable. Now, we should ask not only how can we make the Security Council more representative, but also whether expansion would make it more responsive to the threats to international security that are actually described at the heart of this report. After all, making the UN more responsive to these threats was essentially the main task of the study. Now, in judging any particular plan for expanding the Security Council, we should not only ask whether consensus can be reached on any given particular option or plan. More importantly, we should ask how such a plan would make the Security Council more effective in dealing with such very difficult international problems as Iraq, as Iran, Sudan, and North Korea. The UN can indeed play a vital role in solving these and other world problems. It suffers not so much from inadequate representation or even from a lack of resources. No, it suffers mostly from a lack of political will on the part of some of its member states to solve hard problems like the humanitarian crisis in Darfur, the threat of nuclear weapons in Iran, and the need to stabilize and to democratize Iraq. It also suffers from what I've already mentioned is a democracy deficit. By that I mean the UN doesn't do enough to promote democratic self-governance. I also mean that democracies have too little influence in the United Nations, as I've already said. Until recently, there was a caucus in the UN for every reason under the sun, except promoting democracy. Yet democracy, freedom, and human rights are the principles on which the UN Charter and the UN Declaration of Human Rights are based. Effectively ignoring these principles creates an inherent tension that only confuses the work of the United Nations. That's why we and other democracies, mainly the key nations leading the community of democracies, have initiated a democracy caucus at the UN. We initiated it at the Commission on Human Rights just this spring, where we collaborated on a resolution calling on the UN to consolidate all of its democracy promotion work. We also support the efforts to develop such a caucus in the General Assembly to ensure its work focuses on democratic values, on the rule of law, and also on economic freedom, which can very often be a foundation of democracy and the rule of law. The virtue of setting up a UN Democracy Fund, as the President proposed to the General Assembly in September, would be this. As more and more nations become democratic, the character of the UN itself will become more and more democratic. There will be fewer regimes to fear and to block political and economic freedoms in the UN. Fewer will want to use the UN to act as a counterweight to the power of the United States or our allies in Europe. And more members will cooperate with us to enable the UN to act when and as it should. Now, the United States has many global partners. We have our regional alliances like NATO to deal with problems in the Balkans. We work with the African Union on Darfur. We work a large variety of issues ranging from the Middle East to economic and sustainable development through the G8. We work on helping to stabilize Venezuela in the Organization of American States. And of course, we work on a long list of issues in the UN. All of this to say that America's global partnership is multifaceted. The UN is an organization among many. It is a vital and a central one. We work with the UN on humanitarian relief, on peacekeeping in Africa, on HIV/AIDS prevention, bringing democracy to Afghanistan and to Iraq, on terrorism, countering terrorism, improving human rights, and promoting sound economic and sustainable development policies. But the UN cannot be expected to do everything, of course, and nor should it. The UN would do best to focus on what it does best and not pretend to represent some nascent global government. Now, I begin this talk by sharing some anecdotes about Maryland's role in history from our early days as a nation, and I would like to conclude on a point like this as well. Every time I visit Annapolis, I remember that the State House served there as our country's first peacetime capital. The Continental Congress met there from November 26, 1783 to August 13, 1784. As many of you know, General George Washington resigned as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army in Annapolis. And that is where we ratified the Treaty of Paris, officially ending the Revolutionary War. And so began the story of America. I doubt any patriot back then could have foreseen that Britain would one day be our stalwart partner in advancing the forward strategy of freedom that they started. And truth be told, I doubt very seriously the Founding Fathers themselves would ever have imagined an organization like the United Nations. But in a world where trade occurs, not at speeds measured in knots, but in speeds measured in nanoseconds, and where oceans no longer protect us from those who would wish to do us harm, we must create and invigorate such global partnerships of which the United Nations is a vital and central part. We helped to create the United Nations, and we remain committed to it. And we will continue to strive to make that organization as effective as possible to meet the new and emerging threats of our times. Thank you very much for your attention. I'd be happy to take any questions that you may have.
We thank you for what was truly an extraordinary presentation, I think. It was very clear, and the nature of the UN was nicely articulated, and certainly it was a vivid picture of the various ways in which the United States relates to the United Nations. So we certainly thank you very much. Yes, sir, in the rear. Is there a bias within our policy, expressed as the gentleman did, which complicates our relations in the world?
I think it's safe to say that the Bush administration is a stalwart defender of the security of Israel, as previous administrations have been. And there is, I think, a bipartisan understanding of the importance of defending Israel against its neighbors. I think that you can go on Capitol Hill and find any number of Democrats, and not just Senator Lieberman, but others who will understand the importance of standing by Israel. You mentioned what you described as a double standard on Security Council resolutions. I'm mentioning Iraq as an example. I only have 2 points to say about that. First of all, there were over a period of 12, 14 years, there was resolution after resolution that was passed by the Security Council, many of them unanimously, that expressed the will of the international, or the view of the international community that what Iraq not only did with respect to Kuwait, but also the possibility of developing weapons of mass destruction was a threat not just to the region, but also to the globe, international peace and security, as it was described time and time again in these resolutions. So there was no disagreement that there was a fundamental problem with the regime of Saddam Hussein. I'm not even mentioning the human rights abuses that occurred there. And you may remember that on top of all the other resolutions that had passed, President Bush went to the General Assembly in 2002, and he challenged the United Nations to live up to its principles and also enforce the resolutions on Iraq. And he brought the issue of Iraq back to the Council. The inspectors went in, and they stayed there for a number of months. We passed Resolution 1441, which promised serious consequences if Saddam Hussein did not cooperate and prove that he no longer had these programs. It said very clearly in the resolution that serious consequences would unfold if he did not do that. The President and many other countries in the coalition determined that he was not cooperating, and we went and engaged the intervention to enforce that Resolution 1441 and previous resolutions. So we do see that as an enforcement of the will of the international community and the Security Council resolutions. And the second point I would make to you, if you happen to be overly concerned that we might be moving in the direction of Israel, and just ask yourself a basic question. In the grand scheme of things, most Americans, would they be more threatened by Israel, or are they more threatened by the possibility that Iran may get a nuclear weapon? Or were they more threatened by Iraq? I think it's very clear. Israel is no threat to the United States. It's even preposterous to even suggest that it is. And so I think that what we have to realize is Israel is not only a democracy in the Middle East, but it's very much threatened by many of its neighbors. We understand the problems that exist on the need to have a roadmap to peace. We've been working through the quartet in the United Nations to try to get that moving. The President has made it very clear that with the passing of Yasser Arafat, that he hopes there might be a new opening for a peace process in Israel. This is what needs to be focused on, is trying to bring these two sides together. And the point we're making about the General Assembly of the United Nations, and I've seen this happen many times, a resolution will come up that is condemning, in our estimation, Israel and leaving the other side of it out of the equation. All it does is polarize the situation and make it harder to bring the two of them to come together again. So the United Nations General Assembly at that point is not contributing to a constructive attitude towards peace. And that is the main point of what I'm making when I say that the General Assembly needs to have a different focus.
The question is, if the United Nations, through some mechanism, felt that they should use force, and the United States, because of its national interests, declined, what would we feel about the United Nations proceeding anyway?
Well, there's two aspects, I think, to answering that question. The first is it's a practical matter. If you're talking about any particular threat being brought to the Security Council, we are a permanent member of the Council with a veto. And so I don't think anything would proceed in that Council, particularly that might involve our own forces without our approval. Second of all, as a practical matter, any member of the Security Council or of the UN in general would understand that, that before they would even get to the point of asking that question, they would have come to us, and I think it would have been very clear whether or not that question should be asked. The old saying, you don't ask the question if you don't know the answer to it. I think that the way international politics works, I doubt very seriously we would find ourselves in a situation where we would be sort of forced by the Security Council to do something we don't want to do. And the reality is that most of the time in the last few years, of course, we have been the one who is bringing these issues to the Council, and others have been very cautious. And so I don't think that that is a serious problem. The biggest problem that I said in my speech is that on the one hand, the Security Council and the UN is supposed to be seen as a central force for solving hard collective security problems. And in some cases it does well. It works very well in African peacekeeping operations in the Congo and Cote d'Ivoire and Liberia and Burundi and places like this where there are peacekeeping operations. But where it has a real hard time is in real hard cases where there are international divisions, political interests and economic interests are on the Council are divided. You know, if you go back and you look at the history of the Cold War, the Security Council was not a player throughout most of the Cold War because two of its permanent members, Soviet Union and the United States, were at loggerheads with one another. And the Cold War ended, and then the issue of Iraq with the Kuwait War brought the Security Council of the United Nations back to the forefront again. And it was doing quite well up until the sanctions started falling apart, or the pressure on the sanctions, and the inspectors were kicked out of Iraq in 1998. So we saw it as bringing the issue back into the Council where it had faded away. But the Council can only be as effective as the combined will of its members. And you see that in the case of Iraq, what was particularly historically important there was not that just Russia and China were concerned about the intervention, because they have been opposing many U.S. policies in the past already. That's not what was new. Actually, they supported U.S. policy in Iraq in the first Gulf War. But what was really particularly important was that our allies, France and Germany, disagree with us. That's what it made it particularly important. Now that means that international politics still matters. You know, these countries are sovereign countries. They have their own views, and they bring their own views to the table when they come to these meetings of the Security Council, the Commission on Human Rights, or whatever. China has economic interests in Sudan. That's why it's hard to get them to agree to sanctions against Sudan over Darfur. Russia and France had economic interests in Iraq. We all know that. So all of this comes into play. And so you have to realize that you're still dealing with an organization that is made up of nation states. And they still operate this way, and the sooner we realize that, the more effective we can be.
What will be the process for figuring out how to respond to the panel's recommendations?
Well, first of all, let me agree with your assessment of the UNHCR, the Refugee Commission of the UN. It does do good work. We are very supportive of it. It's precisely one of those UN agencies that does really good work and doesn't get a lot of credit and doesn't get a lot of attention. Most of the attention goes to the Security Council and the Commission on Human Rights, where there's all this political fireworks. But there, the UNHCR works very well. On the how we are going to respond to this high-level report that was issued last week, before I answer your question about how we're going to organize ourselves to respond to it, let me just explain to everybody what this is. I think most of you may know it, but Kofi Annan, a little over a year ago, in the wake of the Iraq War, and what he thought was the inability of the Security Council to come to a proper position on the Iraq War, and other criticisms that were coming of the UN, decided to bring together an eminent group of persons. It included Brent Scowcroft from the United States, Evgeny Primakov from Russia, and the former Deputy Prime Minister of China, and some other people, to look at how the UN should be organized in this new environment, mainly with the threats of terrorism, WMD. And the report came out last week, and everybody's digesting it. I spent a good hour and a half at the White House today in an interagency meeting discussing this very question. We expect, this is just a report from some outside experts. It has no real authority yet from the UN, but in March, we expect the Secretary General to issue his own report on UN reform. And he will be taking items from this high-level panel report and maybe some other ideas. And then coming in March, you could very well have a Secretariat reform proposal. And then it could get in, mixed in with some other things that are happening in the UN, including a high-level event or a summit at the end of the 5-year review process of the Millennium Development Goals that will be occurring in September. So there's a lot going to go on this year, and there's going to be a huge debate on a whole variety of issues on UN reform, which I mentioned in my speech. So what we're doing is I've already, as a matter of fact, the statement I made this evening, I think, was the first public statement we've made about the high-level panel report. And we have a very considered, cautious, and comprehensive process underway in the government, looking at all aspects of this report. We welcome the report. We want to take a constructive attitude towards it. We think there's some good ideas in there, some ideas that need modification, and there are some issues in there that we disagree with, which I've already alluded to. And so once we get all of this process done, we will have a more concerted assessment of it than I gave you tonight on all the various aspects of it, because the report covers everything. It covers threats, it covers terrorism, it covers Security Council expansion, economic development, human rights, you name it. This report goes in, and it's a comprehensive review of the UN. And so we want to take our time and make sure that our assessment of it is credible, and also, when we do come out with our views, convincing.
Would you comment upon the Food for Oil program and whether we should have seen more of the flaws that were within it? Would you comment upon the TAD, which Mr. Annan's son has taken from the top? And then thirdly, which I've now missed, would you comment upon the series of charges that the United States has not played its proper role in the UN, late payment of dues and things of that kind?
Well, it would not be appropriate for me to comment on these charges against the Secretary General's son, because we don't know if there's anything there or not. This is, there's some media speculation. There's the Volcker Commission that's looking into the oil for food issue. We will be seeing a report, probably interim report sometime in the next couple of months. Let the chips fall where they may, but I don't, I'm not assuming anybody is guilty until we see that report. So I think that that's the most appropriate thing I can say about that. On the issue of oil for food in general, the United States and the UK, as members of the 661 committee, as it was called, the Sanctions Committee, we indeed were concerned about some of the problems that were occurring in the oil for food program, and we did bring them to the attention of both the UN and the other members of the committee. We did it repeatedly. But the committee worked on the basis of consensus. This is the way it was set up, it was the way it was managed. And so when we brought up these concerns, we were unable to persuade some of the other countries who were members of the Security Council to agree with us. I think that if you go back and look at the record, and there'll be more of this coming out in the future, I think it will be a very hard stretch to blame the United States and the UK for some of these developments. Once again, we have to wait and see what the Volcker Commission comes up with. There are lots of charges out there. We're not presuming anyone's guilty until we see these reports. But the evidence mainly about that we saw about some of these charges really came out only after the intervention in Iraq, when we got access to some of these records of the Ministry of Oil. And some of the evidence that had been seen before was a little spotty. It was there. A lot of people knew about this. There was a possibility of oil surcharges and humanitarian kickbacks and the smuggling of oil. And we and even in the previous administration brought these issues to the attention of the 661 Committee. Now, on the issue of, you mentioned a whole variety of things there about UN dues and the ICC. I mean, this administration has a view that the International Criminal Court is not in the interest of the United States, and that is not part of the UN. It's a separate treaty. So the ICC is not a part of the UN universe. Neither is the Kyoto Protocol, for that matter. So these are separate issues. The withholding of dues in the 1990s, which was supported by Senator Biden and many other Democrats in the Senate, and also even by the Clinton administration, was used as leverage to try to get the United Nations to reform. And most people, including the former Ambassador Holbrooke and others, believe, and Ambassador Holbrooke was the one who was negotiating it in New York, believed it was a success, that it actually got the UN to be a better place. So I think that you have to put a lot of these issues in context in order to get a full appreciation of them.
The question is, do the great powers veto get in the way of the Security Council being an effective body?
I don't think so. I don't believe it gets in the way. It was interesting the other day, President Putin was asked about the veto, and I think he got himself in a little bit of trouble because he sort of was implying that when he was talking about India's candidacy in the Security Council, that there might be some countries that don't have a veto if they're permanent members. And the point was, he eventually said that no, if you're a permanent member, you have a veto. No surprise, the permanent five want to maintain the veto. I think that you know, the original founders of the United Nations, learning the lessons of the failure of the League of Nations, realized that the UN had to be a pragmatic institution that operated with the realities of international power. That it couldn't be just an ideal organization, just relying on good ideas and idea principles. There had to be some kind of a compromise. And that's exactly what the United Nations was, and that's why the Security Council is formed the way it was formed, and that's why the permanent five members were given special status. And that's still true. It's still true that some countries have more military capability than others. This is a reality of international life. I don't think that we would realistically expect that any time that the American people would voluntarily say that, well, we will put U.S. armed forces at the disposal of an international body, and by the way, we don't have a veto, and whatever that committee decides that my son and daughter are going to go to war, that's where they're going to go. I don't think so. And I don't think it'd even be right to even propose such a thing, because there would not be the proper accountability between those who are actually paying for and making the sacrifices and having some kind of a role in the decision to actually send your sons and daughters to war.
How can the United States be better at arm twisting in the UN?
I think we ought to form a committee here, sort of a model United Nations, sir, and perhaps with some other people who've asked me some questions, we could get you together. We can call it the Commission on Human Rights. No. Well, look, it is a, you know, it's a challenge. You know, we often, the United States, it's happened here this evening, is often accused of not paying proper deference and attention to the UN, of going our own way, being unilateralist, and the like. And as somebody who's been in this job for 2 years and spent most of my time over those 2 years working in the Security Council and the issue of Iraq, I can only say that after 5 Security Council resolutions on Iraq, a resolution that actually established the occupation legal framework for the Coalition Provisional Authority, which was passed unanimously by the Council, including France, and then the resolution that created the legal authority for the turnover of sovereignty to the interim government. That was also done by the Security Council. That was done unanimously, including votes by Russia and France. So the Security Council was used throughout this entire time to help manage the transition process on Iraq. And all of that time, particularly over the last 6 months, Most of my time has been trying to coax and encourage the United Nations to become more involved in Iraq, because, as many of you know, they had the situation where Sergio Vieira de Mello was killed in that car bomb over a year ago, and the UN pulled out its personnel at that point. And so we had this paradox where a real hard case like Iraq, we are trying to get the UN more involved, and there is a reluctance on the part of some of the UN to get involved. And there's also a reluctance on the part of some of the Security Council members who oppose the war also to support that involvement. It is true that most of the differences have been put aside, which is reflected in those resolutions, unanimous resolutions that occurred after the fighting began, and actually established the legal transition framework for a sovereign Iraq. But my main point is that I'm trying to say that on the hard cases, whether it's Iraq or on Iran, working on the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, and trying to make sure that Iran doesn't get nuclear weapons, or trying to ensure that North Korea doesn't get nuclear weapons. We work through these international organizations every single day. We are there, a nation, presenting our point of view just as strongly as France and Russia do. And believe me, they're not at all shy about representing their points of view. Not at all. They think they're just as right as we are. And that's fine. That's their prerogative. That's their right. But I don't want to apologize as Americans for representing our views as well. And that's what we feel we're doing for the American people when we go there and we represent our views and try to fight for our own interests. And we do it because we think it's right. And so I think that really, when it comes to the Security Council, we have tried to engage them as best we can on some of these hard issues, and I've mentioned them. The General Assembly is a different story. That's hard. There's 191 countries there. There's all kinds of regional blocks and groupings. There's the Islamic Conference, there's the Arab group, there's the African group, there's the European Union, there's the non-aligned movement, it's called the G77. There's all these regional groupings. They get together and they coordinate their votes, and they coordinate their policies, and they coordinate their activities. And they are very effective at mobilizing the votes. And that accounts more than anything for some of these lopsided votes you see in the General Assembly. You know, European Union coordinates its votes. They don't coordinate with us. They coordinate with the European Union. So often, you know, we have to coordinate. We don't have any groupings. We're the United States. And so we have all this extraordinary influence in the Security Council. But in the General Assembly, not so.
Would you comment on the process of changing membership in the Security Council?
Well, there are a number of countries now that are asking to be permanent members of the Security Council. Japan, Germany, Brazil, and India are the countries that have said that they wish to be permanent members with a full veto right. The way that is done is the General Assembly would have to pass a resolution with a 2/3 majority. Then, if that passes, the permanent 5 of the Security Council would have to agree to the particular plan of expanding the council. And then, at that point, it has to be ratified by the legislatures of all of the P5 countries. And because it is essentially you're amending the UN Charter, which is a treaty. And so ultimately this question would have to go to our own Senate, because you would be amending the UN Charter by adding permanent members to the UN Security Council.
Would you just comment briefly on the question of whether there's any basis for the finding of or the charge of weapons of mass destruction being in Saddam's possession realistically at any point?
Well, let me go back to a point I made earlier about some of the history of our involvement on this issue in the Security Council. I mentioned earlier that there's a resolution that passed in November 2002, Resolution 1441, which was a couple of months after the President went to the General Assembly and gave his speech on Iraq. You may remember it. And he challenged the Security Council to enforce previous resolutions. And what that resolution said, I encourage you to go to the UN site, get it, download it, and read it, What it did was it cataloged all the previous resolutions about Iraq, and it stated, and we all knew at the time, and the UN inspectors had proven it, that there was a time where Saddam Hussein indeed had WMD. We know he did. He declared some of them, but the inspectors in the early 90s, mid-90s found others. And then the inspectors were kicked out in 1998. So the question was, at that moment, from 98 up to 2002, is what happened to the WMD that the UN said, and all the intelligence community said, that he had? We did not know. We had intelligence suggesting this or that, so did the other countries of Europe, but we did not know. And so the purpose of putting the inspectors back in there was to prove to ourselves that, in fact, he did not have them. So we could rest assured that the region and we and others were safe from these weapons. So the inspectors went back in late 2002 and started looking at this issue. So the way the Resolution 1441 was written, it was written with the main issue that would determine whether or not there was a breach or a compliance of the regime of Saddam Hussein with this resolution, was whether or not he was fully cooperating. In other words, that was the legal trigger. And if he did not cooperate, there would be serious consequences. It's all spelled out there. It was intentionally negotiated that way, and France and others agreed to it. It was not a matter of, well, if we find WMD beforehand, because the way it was set up, the inspectors were there to verify and have Saddam Hussein prove that, in fact, he had given them up, and he was not doing that. And even after we went in there, we discovered that he had things that he was hiding. So he was illegally not complying with Resolution 1441. We proved that after we went in there. Now, you can say, well, that's been boiled down into the sort of the popular mind. Well, this is all we went in there to get the WMD. I just described to you exactly what we were doing in the Security Council. Now, if it sounds as if this is all sort of legalisms, that's what the Security Council and international law is all about. We are sometimes accused of violating international law, and I want to tell you that we were enforcing Resolution 1441 that said that serious consequences would come if Saddam Hussein did not prove that he had given up his weapons of mass destruction, and he did not do that.
I'm going to have to disappoint you, and we have gone a little bit over our time. On behalf of everyone here, I'd like to thank you for what I thought was quite an extraordinary, clear, lucid, and complete presentation. Thank you.
Well, thanks.